Here he is.
Can you give me some time? How's that go? Just because I couldn't talk.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Careful. I've got a lot of slides and a lot of stuff. But I'll aim for 20 minutes.
Okay.
10 minutes would be perfect in 5 minutes.
Yep.
And I'll wrap up. I'm Charles Font. I am a special instructor in the sociology department. I am finishing up my PhD at McGill University in sociology. It focuses on poverty studies. I am beginning a postdoc with the Community Health and Epidemiology department here in New York. I co-founded Upstream a few years ago and was the author behind the Poverty Cost Report and was very active in that campaign. That was like 2013, 2015. It was instrumental in getting the provincial government to commit to a comprehensive poverty reduction strategy. And just recently, my first book called Combating Poverty, Quebec's approach to Quebec's attempt to take a distinct approach to the welfare state, with the University of Toronto Press just came out. It's an evaluation of Quebec's efforts with poverty reduction strategies, and it compares what we've seen in Quebec between the year 2000 and 2010 with Alberta, Ontario, and British Columbia. That's been pretty exciting. And I get to say I wrote the book on poverty. So it was pretty loose. I think my instructions for today. I was going to set up the context, but I think what I'm going to do is reframe, since I'm now speaking second, I'm going to reframe what I'm doing as I'm going to touch on some key concepts, introduce some key concepts, frameworks, and a few stylized facts that I've learned to be helpful around talking about poverty and some of the work that I've done in the past, and that I think could be of use to you guys as you go forward, or all of us. I include me in as we move forward around poverty advocacy in Saskatchewan, and specifically in Saskatoon, and mobilizing action around a comprehensive poverty reduction strategy for this community. So I've got a whole bunch of things I can talk about. Say I have 40 minutes, or maybe 2 hours, depending on how I go. But I'll open up talking a little bit about what poverty is, how I like to think about it, talk about some arguments for why we should care about poverty. Some of this is very much going to be preaching to the converted, but I hope to maybe provide different perspectives than maybe you're used to. Then I'm going to talk about what a comprehensive poverty reduction strategy is. I think this is probably the more important stuff as we go forward, at least in the short term. What are the components of a comprehensive poverty reduction strategy when we look at them? I'm going to be focusing at the provincial level. That's where most of my work is focused. Colleen's the city level strategies, which she just shared. I may or may not talk a little bit about Saskatchewan's comprehensive poverty reduction strategy. But I'm going to try to get to what the effects of poverty reduction strategies have been and what is the current state of poverty in Saskatchewan. The opportunity of this presentation to visit some data and make some pretty graphs. So I'm looking forward to sharing those. And then finally, this might bleed into the discussion, but how can we ensure that the Saskatoon CPRS is actually effective? So picking up on the topic of poverty, here's two generic images of poverty. On the left, we have a very stereotypical image that we often associate. If you just Google poverty, I think this is poverty in Canada. I think this is actually the stock image that comes up. And on the right, this is another image that I grabbed just to sort of show like a cool, hip, like Station 20 type environment where you have like young people working, but maybe the woman in the back is an intern who's earning less than a living wage if she's even getting paid, right? This is also the face of poverty, precarious work in our society. And I actually like to point out to people, coming to it from a data analysis and methodological standpoint, even though our image of poverty is often the fellow on the left, this elderly homeless person, typically in our poverty statistics that we actually work with, that fellow isn't actually in the survey. So like when you see a poverty rate of like 15%, people that experience poverty the way that guy's experiencing poverty like literally aren't in that number. So when we think about poverty, it's important to recognize that is, even though that's our idea, it's actually a very atypical poverty experience. Relatively few people for whom poverty actually looks like that. There's a lot more where it looks a lot more innocuous and a lot more everyday, which is on the right. So what do we mean by poverty? Susan Marty Sandy's a big influence on poverty. And he defines poverty, and this is the definition that I like. Poverty is not just a lack of money, it's not having the capability to realize one's full potential as a human being. I like that definition of poverty because it brings us to thinking about opportunities, thinking about poverty as an absence of opportunities. In a lot of my work, I stress how that has two implications. If you have access to fewer opportunities, you have fewer ways to access these opportunities. Like if something good happens to you, you have fewer resources with which to capitalize on life's opportunities. And similarly, if something bad happens to you, you have fewer resources to mitigate against those bad things and recover from bad things. Now, for a bunch of fancy math reasons that I articulate in other work, what this actually results in is people being more at risk of experiencing something that we recognize colloquially as a vicious cycle. For this idea that if something bad happens to you, that just because something bad has happened to you, more bad things are going to happen to you. That's a really problematic dynamic, and it motivates, I think, in my work I describe this stuff mathematically, but I think intuitively, I think that's what motivates a lot of energy around poverty and why people find it so problematic. On a moral level, it's problematic because we don't think people should suffer misfortune just because they've already suffered misfortune. That's just intrinsically unjust. We just recognize that. People that think are going to experience bad things, it should be because of choices they made, not because they just were unlucky in the past. Similarly, for economic reasons, it's really bad for the economy if people experience vicious dynamics. There's a whole bunch of economic reasons. It leads to economic behavior that it prevents innovation, it prevents investment, it prevents a whole bunch of things that are really important to economic growth. And then so this vicious dynamic also, it links the moral, it links the economic aspects of poverty. So, why does poverty matter right now in Saskatchewan? Well, Saskatchewan's economy is experiencing a downturn. Poverty undermines, in the big picture, because of these dynamics, poverty tries to undermine the economy in the short and the long run. I already talked about the human rights side, which is more on the moral. I'm trying to emphasize the economic side of it. Poverty degrades people's health, their social relations, and their skills. So during a period of downturn where people are falling so far that they're falling into poverty that it could be causing people lasting damage. And of course, it prevents people from making the kinds of investments that they need to make to be able to get back on their feet. So it's not only when you have an economic downturn, people fall into poverty. But if you allow people to fall into poverty, it causes lasting degradation. At the individual level, poverty prevents people from bouncing back, but at that macro level as well, it actually makes it so that recessions last longer than they otherwise would if we don't address poverty during this period. So a few years ago, we came up with a pithy way to summarize some of these arguments, and we emphasized the cost of poverty in Saskatchewan. At that time, it was $3.8 billion, about 4% of GDP, which it will still be about the same, maybe a little bit lower. And we found that this was an effective framework and talking point for dealing with certain audiences, especially within the government of the day, which is the government of today as well. So, and through that initiative around poverty costs, we were able to convince that we did actually get the government, as you all know, to commit to a comprehensive poverty reduction strategy. And we're kind of in the process of going through that right now and deciding, well, yeah. I'll talk a bit more about it in a minute. So, but before I launch into that, Saskatchewan has a poverty reduction strategy. Let's talk about what a comprehensive poverty reduction strategy is. So the C, comprehensive poverty reduction strategy, the C in CPRS stands for comprehensive. CPRS is a government strategy that has been developed to address the complex and systematic nature of poverty. It describes how to deal with poverty in a comprehensive and coordinated way. It's not just a statement of values or a list of programs. It's about how these parts work together to realize a defined goal. And the reason why we need a strategy, and the reason why it needs to be comprehensive, is because poverty is complex. Harkening back to my initial slide showing these different faces of poverty, it's easy to think of poverty as like one thing. An absence of opportunities, but different people have different reasons for why they are there poor. There's different dynamics. For some people it's going to be income, and sometimes when we're a little bit too naive about things, we think it's just about income, but it's also about transportation, it's about childcare, it's about access to employment, skills, education. There's so many different things that go into it, and because of that complexity, it's not just one policy that's going to solve poverty. It's going to require coordinated and intentional effort. So that's why we talk about poverty reduction strategies so much. To try and get the government to recognize that poverty is complicated, but also get the government thinking about poverty and taking it on as a complicated phenomenon. So the typical stages of a comprehensive poverty reduction strategy, I found in my research it's helpful to split them into, there's a commitment phase. I've ignored this is the typical stages from the government. Obviously there's an advocacy stage before that. So there's an initial commitment stage that's followed by a consultation stage, typically of some kind. There's the actual launch of the action plan, which is like the actual poverty reduction strategy. This is followed by years of implementation and evaluation, and then followed by renewal and resequencing. And what's interesting is that when you look at the other provinces, not everybody goes along all of these steps. There's lots of these processes. Like when we advocated for the poverty reduction strategy, we often think about the commitment as like the end goal. But what we've seen in other provinces, and even in Saskatchewan, I think, to a degree, is that it's actually an ongoing thing. That every step along this way, the process can completely derail. And so, for example, Alberta committed to a comprehensive poverty reduction strategy like 5 years ago. I think it was, maybe it wasn't. It was 3 or 4 years. It was 2013 or 2014. I have it written down in one of my slides here. And they've never actually done an action plan. They did do about 2 years of consultation, but Alberta still to this day doesn't have an action plan. So like, talking about derailment. In Saskatchewan, we got an action plan, but we weren't very happy with it. Similarly, you have other provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador implemented a very successful poverty reduction strategy. They've gone through all of these steps, but they've never renewed it. It's been like 50 years. Okay, so they never got to that last step. So these are important things to think about as we go forward, and as we think about how we structure the process around that. I can't stress it enough. CPRS. The concept of a poverty reduction strategy, the concept of recognizing poverty as being complicated and knowing that it's going to take systematic solutions and coordination to deal with it, is a completely nonpartisan issue. Partisanship can emerge in some of the components. There's different dimensions to this, to what should go into the strategy, and left and right have different ideas about what should go into that. But at the superficial level, I'd like to stress that the poverty reduction strategy itself is nonpartisan. I'll talk about some of the components in the middle. Well, and we've seen that in Saskatchewan. We've seen all kinds of governments implement poverty reduction strategies, and we've even seen governments change and poverty reduction strategies continue to be implemented. Yeah, it's not like you need an NDP government to get this through. So speaking of those dimensions of a poverty reduction strategy, I find it helpful to talk about these 5 areas, these 5 different ways, and in each of these areas there's some subcategories. But I think of each of these not as like, this isn't a checklist, this is like, these are dimensions, these are like spectrums. Each one of these is a spectrum, and you can have more or less effective targets and timelines. You can have more or less effective accountability mechanisms, comprehensive solutions, equity measures, and consultation. So in the targets and timelines category, we talk about measures, timelines, and targets. Okay. This item details what the plan aims to accomplish and how long it will take to realize its achievements. Like I said, some measures, timelines, and targets are more effective than others. Accountability mechanisms relate to how we actually track our progress along the process of achieving our goals and making sure that people are tasked with actually doing it. So, for example, in Saskatchewan, I think, I'll get into what was actually built into the Saskatchewan example, but we have very few accountability mechanisms. They kind of drop the document on us, but there's nobody to really be like, hey, it's not working. And no way to really, and because they didn't really build into it, it's really hard to say whether it's working or not either. They don't know what it is. So, I've got 10 minutes? Okay. Comprehensive solutions. I'm used to talking for 10 minutes, so I feel like I have like a lot of time right now, which is awesome. Accountability mechanisms, comprehensive solutions. So this relates to, Colleen actually kind of already touched on this. There's a number that have already been identified. I would add to this probably now, like reconciliation, Saskatchewan could be something to add to our comprehensive. But yeah, there's a couple of reports that have sort of detailed the different areas, and different poverty reduction strategies cover more or less of these things. Equity measures is actually it's a really, like, it's actually a really interesting thing, and I split it out from comprehensivity because it relates to, I can't remember what the paradox was called off the top of my head. There's this idea that sometimes when you implement like a universal part, when you implement a program, if you don't design mechanisms to ensure that it actually reaches the people that are most vulnerable, you can risk leaving them behind and increasing inequalities. And especially in poverty, we worry about inequality even among the poor. So it's important to be mindful of what are the groups that are least likely to be targeted by the comprehensive solutions and build an equity mechanism to ensure that they are reached. So these are a few dimensions of equity that are important, typically in these reports or in these action plans. And then finally, there's the matter of consultation. Most comprehensive poverty reduction strategies have some sort of initial consultation process, even the Saskatchewan one. But others have more of an mechanisms that are more ongoing. And as you move on to, actually, when you think about the accountability mechanisms, often comprehensive poverty reduction strategies that are designed to be renewed and get to that last stage and then implemented again. So Ontario is an example that's been pretty successful with that. They'll legislate the renewal process, and in the process of legislating the renewal, they'll also stipulate like when consultations start again for the next poverty reduction strategy. Okay. So do these things work? Sometimes. As you can imagine, there's a lot of variables in a poverty reduction strategy. And I think it's essential for governments and communities to get to a place where we're thinking about poverty reduction strategies, just embracing that tool, like I was saying earlier, like it puts a lot on the table and gets it out there and agreed upon. That being said, no, they haven't all been effective. A couple have been particularly effective. Newfoundland, a couple of the early ones were particularly effective. And I haven't actually modeled this and measured it. But my sense is that the governments that have dragged their feet the longest, like in some ways the governments that were most eager to reduce poverty were the first to admit, or the communities that were most eager to reduce poverty were the first to commit to poverty reduction strategies and actually had an impact, whereas at the tail end you've got maybe examples like the Saskatchewan where they were sort of maybe dragged along a little bit more, and it's less. In some ways, some of these poverty reduction strategies have gotten weaker and weaker as provinces have sort of been brought along. But yeah, this is just a pretty picture. But in general, the summary is they can be effective, but they don't have to be effective. And this also relates to what I was talking about earlier about that process. And thinking about the poverty reduction strategy is an ongoing thing. It's not just about getting the commitment and the strategy. It's about constantly working along this pathway, and then thinking about renewal and thinking about how we have to go through that. It's actually more of a circle. You can do it over and over again. You're going to be really effective. And I'll talk about that, and I can talk about that a little bit more at the end. So I think that's really the key of the comprehensive poverty reduction strategy is setting that cycle in motion. And if you fail to get that cycle, it's less likely to work. So I already talked a little bit about how the Saskatchewan plan stacks up, and I presented it last year actually to the SPRP, so I don't need to get to it too much. But in general, the current plan talks a pretty good talk, but it's pretty thin on accountability and consultation. And even though it has a target, it was kind of interesting. This is almost a funny story. They managed, the government set the ambitious goal to reduce the number of Saskatchewan people who experience poverty for 2 years or more by 50% by the year 2025. This was a really ironic goal for them to pick a couple of years ago because at that time we literally didn't collect data on this and there was no way to actually assess it. I don't think the person who was tasked with picking that actually fully understood that. Now, the irony is that one of the reasons we didn't have that information was because of some cutbacks with the federal government around StatCan, and we lost our longitudinal data. In the vacuum that created, StatCan has shifted to using a different type of data, using tax filer data. So what's actually interesting is that going forward, we are actually going to be able to evaluate this, and we're actually going to be able to evaluate in hindsight. So the joke's on them. We're not there yet in terms of actually having this data, it's still pretty good. This is the data now that we need to evaluate that, but we will be able to evaluate this in the years to come, so that excites me. But yeah, really weak on the accountability side of things. All right. How much time do I have?
5, 4, 3, 4.
I'm going to talk about some facts around poverty in Saskatchewan. I'll skip the bit around how do we ensure these things are successful. I think I've already touched on that enough. So that was my general summary of Saskatchewan CPRS. That talks a good talk, but it lacks a lot of details about how it's actually going to be. But let's talk a little bit about measurement, and let's talk a little bit about what the current state of poverty is in Saskatchewan. So, and this relates actually, this segues nicely from what I was just talking about. So, we've changed the way that we've measured poverty in the last couple of years, specifically more around how we collect data around poverty, around income, which we then use to measure poverty. And you may have noticed, if you're paying close attention, that Saskatchewan in the last 2 years went from having some of the least poverty in Canada to some of the most poverty. That is almost completely a consequence of our shift from using the Survey of Labor and Income Dynamics, which was a respondent survey that would call you on the phone and ask you what your earnings were, what your household income was, shifting from a survey response data format to a tax filer. Now they're using income files that they grabbed from the Canadian Revenue Agency that we call the T1FF file. So we're still using the same threshold, but now we have everybody who files taxes. And what happens with that is that there's a whole bunch of populations that were excluded from the survey. So, for example, the homeless fellow earlier is way more likely to show up as a tax filer. In Saskatchewan, this has been a major issue because of our on-reserve populations. These populations have traditionally been excluded from surveys as stats can, but now that we're working with administrative data, tax filer data, they're included. And so you can see the green line is our poverty rate with the survey response, and then the blue line is when we shift to administrative data. It's been like a 3-point increase in our poverty rate just because we've shifted the data that's being used. Now, on the other hand, there is some optimism in there. The trend up to 2015 is downward in Saskatchewan. So in all of the next slides, I'm going to show you the green line is a really important one. The green line is sometimes going to be Saskatchewan, sometimes going to be Saskatoon, which is the green line. But you can see we've gone from having some of the highest poverty in the country at the provincial level in the early 2000s to being around the middle of the pack in 2015. But there is a generally downward trend, and if you compare, say, to Manitoba, which is the top line, their trend is pretty flat. And Manitoba is high and flat, actually. Around child poverty, those things are less good. Saskatchewan has very high child poverty rates at the national level, and Campaign 2000 brought some attention to that just recently. They released a report in November. At the level of Saskatoon, when we look at Saskatoon, Saskatoon now is the green line, and we're comparing it within Saskatchewan. You can see that Saskatoon is near the pack, but we're at the high end if you ignore Prince Albert. And I've left North Battleford out, but I'm pretty sure North Battleford is similar to Prince Albert. I actually live in Prince Albert, and I was telling my partner this morning, I was telling her about these numbers, and I was saying, like, living in Prince Albert is the difference between living in, like, a Canadian city and living in an American city. In a way, like, the experience of Prince Albert is more like living in, like, you know, like Twin Falls, Minnesota or something, or Minneapolis. In terms of that poverty rate, it would be more typical of an American city. The Saskatoon is doing well, but not as well as Swift Current, which has really benefited from Brad Wall. They're doing very well. Similarly, in child poverty, Saskatoon is sort of same position relative to the other cities. What's interesting is actually when we zoom out to the city, like to the cities across the country, Saskatoon is doing relatively well on poverty. So that actually means that the cities in Saskatchewan are doing relatively well on poverty, especially when you compare them to Toronto or Vancouver, which are sort of at the top there. That being said, that story really changes when we focus on child poverty. All of a sudden, we're really bad. You guys will notice the y-axes are changing on these. So you guys can see them. So these, even though those lines look like they went down, they actually went up. And everybody else kind of grouped with Saskatoon higher up.
Can you talk a bit about that? Why child poverty?
That's my next slide.
Okay.
I'll summarize this now. That's my next slide. So, yeah, child poverty tends to be higher than overall poverty in Canada. But specifically, it's interesting to see Saskatoon go from one of the, like, kind of a leader on poverty when we just look at poverty, when we look at child poverty not illegal anymore. And that brings me to your point. Child poverty is a choice. It's one of the really interesting things that come out of the latest numbers. We just got some numbers in the 2016 census, which is insane. Saskatoon reduced their turnaround time by like 20
Years.
Like years, literally years. Yeah, yeah. The fact that I'm talking about numbers from 2016 at the end of 2017 is like, wow.
Remarkable.
But one of the most interesting things about the numbers that I saw around poverty in the 2016 result was that in Quebec is now the only province in Canada where its child poverty rate is lower than its overall poverty rate. It also has a very low overall poverty rate. And that is really, to me what that is saying is that this child poverty is exactly what we were saying it was in the 90s and why campaign 2000. Child poverty is really a choice. The fact that we have such huge gaps. So what this graph is showing, this is actually showing the child poverty rate minus the overall poverty rate. So the higher that number is, so the higher the line is, that's showing a bigger gap between the child poverty rate and the poverty rate. And you can see Quebec, which is the blue line there, is actually approaching 0%, being no different in 2015, and we know now that in 2016 it's actually gone a little bit negative. Whereas in contrast, in Saskatchewan, you have like over a 10-point gap. Similarly, when you look at Saskatoon, in that context of the other cities in Canada, only Saskatoon and Winnipeg are really outliers in terms of the gap between child poverty and poverty in our province. Okay. And if you look at some of the other cities, some of those cities that maybe have higher poverty rates than us, they have a much lower gap. Obviously in Montreal, but even in Vancouver and Toronto. So the calibration that we can do in Saskatoon around child poverty that we can vote on. So what will Saskatoon choose? I have a few more slides about the recent past. Right now, the trend in poverty in Saskatchewan is downward. There are reasons to think it is going up. Like I know from the food banks in the last couple of years, they've had massive upticks. So it'll be interesting see whether that's because more people are falling into poverty or the poor are just getting poorer. But it's not like, I don't want people to think that just because the green line's going down, that's like no reason that we're on the right path. So this is some things to talk about. And yeah, just generally closing. Yeah, I'm sure I've talked for 20 minutes now. The last few slides are just about the value of once you get the CPRS and you get to this cycle, there's this, the comprehensive poverty reduction strategy really creates a space for learning. If it's done right, there's this opportunity for policy learning that wasn't there before around poverty, and that could be really valuable. And in the cases where poverty reduction strategies have the most impact, that's what they've done effectively. Thank you. How long did I actually talk?
I don't know. I didn't really pay attention. 36 minutes.
Okay. Went to my 40 minutes.